Good to go? Terrific. Well, hello, everybody. I'm really excited about, whoop, oh, we're good. Okay. I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm Rich Powell, the CEO of ClearPath. We're DC-based organizations focused on driving policies that accelerate breakthrough innovations to reduce and remove global energy emissions. And I'm so excited to be here with Senator Lisa Murkowski because there is no greater champion of that very agenda, of that innovation agenda toward clean energy and climate solutions than Senator Murkowski. So I'm so excited to be here. I do first need to have a big thanks to Arizona State University, to the Rainey Center for creating the opportunity for this terrific, very intimate conversation. We're all right here together. So we're going to go through a number of topics related to both U.S. policy and its interlinkage with the rest of the world. Senator, I wonder if you can, if you can just start by telling us why you're here and what you've noticed so far about this COP. I know you've come to many COPs before, but what you've noticed about this one here in Dubai, and what messages you're bringing on your trip here,
Well, I could be a real smart aleck, Rich, and say the reason I'm here is because you're here, and I wanted to sit down with you because I love
amongst
what
other
you're
things.
what you're
Amongst other
doing at
things.
ClearPath.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
let me just thank you for that. Uh, but I am here at COP28 because I think it's so important that we understand, we as policymakers from the United States understand not only the conversations that are being held or globally, but are active participants in these conversations that are being held. We are working on a global challenge. And so it requires us in the mix. And when I say us in the mix, it requires all of us. It is those that have been active and aggressive in trying to put in climate policy for years. I'm traveling on a bipartisan Senate Codel with Ed Markey. Markey has been working to try to advance legislation on climate for as long as he's been out there. But I think it's also important for people like me that come from an oil producing state, an oil and gas, coal. We are a fossil producing, we produce from our fossil base here to not only be part of these discussions, and some have suggested that it's that old maxim that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. I don't think it's that way. I want to be part of the solution because I think Alaska is part of the solution. When you think about the technologies that we have put in place because we have to, because we operate in a fragile Arctic environment, the way that we have to um, develop and produce in ways that might be different, but maybe are a little cutting edge for some who have been able to use practices that were perhaps not as environmentally uh, uh, conscious, I guess. Um, so there's a lot of good reasons to be here. This is my second one. I was in Glasgow. Uh, Glasgow was informative and interesting. This is kind of like on steroids. You got to remember, I'm from Alaska. I don't get out a lot. This is like Las Vegas plus plus plus. The energy innovation hall is just like mind blowing in a great and exciting way. And so I think it's as much about the significant policy discussions as it is the opportunity to come and be stimulated, to come and 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 realize that there's some takeaways here that we can all use to do better. So I'm encouraged. We've had some good meetings already. We've got, I think, a good message from the United States perspective that uh, whether we whether we have put in place what you would call quote climate policies, what we have put in place over the years with many of our energy initiatives have helped us work to reduce our emissions in a meaningful and a very specific way that other countries around the world are paying attention to. So I think we've got a good news story to tell. I'm happy to be telling it, and I'm happy to be with a group that is bipartisan. Now, I recognize I am the bi in bipartisan. Um, I'm okay with that because I think that what happens is we need to bring others into the conversation, and we're building on that. The House has a bipartisan group that I know many of you have met with, and they're growing every single year. That's what we should be doing. So lots of good reasons to be at COP28. In addition, they have camel ice cream
We can work at the
here.
camel ice cream. Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I would love to start with the point you mentioned about all of the policy that you've driven in the U.S. So, as chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, an appropriator, as a member of the various gangs that have brought together big bipartisan deals, you've really had a- not just a front row seat, you've been in the driver's seat for so many of these things. Start with the Energy Act of 2020. So, you're sort of, and I call it your crowning achievement as chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Um, that very important piece of legislation authorized this massive program at the Department of Energy to demonstrate all of these innovative clean technologies. Amongst those was advanced nuclear energy. So your Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, so creating the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. And now here we have this global pledge to triple nuclear energy across the US and all of our major trading partners. I wonder if you could give us your views of how policy you've enacted and driven in the US is now driving this global conversation, and maybe what more we could do. Where do you think we go next to make sure that we get these critical technologies out to the rest of the world?
Well, thank you for emphasizing uh, what the Energy Act of 2020 really provided. It was really that base. It was about the authorization and putting in place everything from advanced nuclear to what we were doing to pushing out different technologies in different areas. It was important. We hadn't refreshed, re-upped our energy policy in an even dozen years. And when you think about how fast things are moving in this space, it's just almost incomprehensible to think that we hadn't done that. So, on the nuclear side, so significant. You mentioned NELA and what that did to really kind of push out not only what we've done with advanced nuclear, but focusing on workforce, focusing on the fuels, HALEU, what we were able to do in that space by laying down not only the authorizations, but then these demonstration programs, lots of them, and how that then helped to facilitate. But you do a lot with authorizations, but not if you haven't appropriated to them. And so that's where the next step, which is what we did with the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, really made the difference because we took what we had authorized and we really breathed the life into it through the appropriations. And that was significant. We are seeing that pay off in extraordinary ways. In Alaska alone, over $6 billion coming to a state like ours, where you're working to build out so much of the basic infrastructure that allows you to then take those next steps. So there's so much going on in that space. But what remains to be done? We can put money to it, but it's the implementation phase that we are in right now. And in fairness, if I still had that magic wand, actually, if I could ever get that magic wand, I'd be focusing on the permitting side because we've got we've got the authorization, we've got the money, but now we got to get through a permitting process that is so bogged down, that is so difficult to move through, that when you're talking something that's going to take 10 years to get you there, it's really tough to attract the investors. It's really tough to get the financing for it. So we have got to unlock that. We have got to deal with the permitting side so that then the financing comes a little more readily for so many of the really good things that we have coming. So implementation is going to be key, but we've got to work on permitting.
So I was lucky enough to just come from a conversation with some of your colleagues on the House side over here across the COP site on this topic of permitting reform, and and it was a bipartisan group, and they seemed to be in reasonable agreement that there was a deal out there, a big deal, a high ambition deal. Because if you look at some of these deployment numbers, if we take net zero in the U.S. seriously, that's tens of thousands of projects away. And if you take 2050 seriously, that's 24 years and 3 weeks, 26 years and 3 weeks away. That's 10 to 15 projects a day. And so if you take that seriously, it implies completely rethinking the permitting process. Obviously, you've worked closely with Senator Manchin on that in a bipartisan way. I know that he's now working with your successor on the committee, Senator Barrasso, in a bipartisan way on this. Can you handicap anything for us? What do you think the prospects are of a bipartisan deal on this?
Well, I'm not a gambler, I'm not a bettor, but I will say that when it comes to permitting reform and what more we can do, because we've done incremental bits, all
Sure.
right? Okay. But seriously, do we think that it's a win when we can say that we've reduced the number of pages? I'm sorry. It was a small step and it allows us to say, yeah, we did something here, but there's so much more that has to be done. And I am optimistic that there will be permitting reform and the permitting reform will be real. And the reason for that is both sides want it. Both Republicans and Democrats want it and need it. So I don't care what it is that you are permitting. But if you're looking to do your offshore wind, if you're looking to do your next solar project, I'm sorry, you're going through the same hoops that our oil and gas guys have been going through for a long time. So now you've got common ground here. And so I do feel that this is important. We had a meeting this morning. We started off our day with Secretary Kerry. This subject came up. He says, I think we need to do some kind of an emergency designation. Use the word emergency because
Did you hold him to that? Did you get that in writing?
somebody had it recorded somewhere. But I think it speaks to where we are, that we have we've got ourselves to a good place with legislating and appropriating on it, and now we've just got some things that we've put in place ourselves
Yeah.
with these permitting
Mhm.
barriers. So let's figure out how we can work to expedite, make them more efficient, make them more functional. So uh, I I'm optimistic. Now we are going into a presidential year. We are
Is
approaching.
that this year? That's happening?
What did
Okay.
your clock say? You had. I don't even like to count the days
Uh,
until the next election because it just makes my head spin. But um, it does complicate um, significant legislation passing. But if everybody wants it, it makes it easier to do.
well, and you passed the Energy Act of 2020 in the last presidential
That's
election year. So I think
exactly
the
right.
precedent now
Things can
is
happen.
yeah.
Good things can
Yeah.
happen if what? They're bipartisan. If both sides want them, not only will good things happen, but then they stick around. You don't have the next administration or the next majority in the House or the Senate spending all of their time trying to erode it, undercut it, flip it. And so, yes, good things like this can happen.
Uh, you invoked Alaska a few minutes ago, a favorite
I
topic of
always do.
yours. You always do. You're not just a senator from Alaska. You're an Alaskan senator. You're the senior senator from Alaska. You're a third generation Alaskan. You're the first Alaskan born senator. Um, I know you see things through that lens, and I think it's a very useful lens for the clean energy discussion, as you've said, because even as Alaska is a front line for climate change and climate impacts, it's also a state with significant hydrocarbon and traditional energy resources, and a state with its own energy access challenges. So you really have a microcosm of the global challenge, really, in the state. When you come here and you hear things like this debate over phase down versus phase out fossil fuels and some of these kind of discussions, how does that strike you from your perspective? And what lessons do you think you can bring from thinking of energy policy as an Alaskan energy policymaker? What lessons do you think you can bring to this global conversation?
Well, I think I bring a pragmatism to an urgency. And I think that that's important. Alaska is seeing the impact of climate change in some areas in a dramatic and an unsettling way. And so for me, there's not a lot of discussion about if or when or what. We're seeing it. And so that translates into an urgency. So where are we? What are we doing about it? Earlier, I made the statement that in Alaska, not a lot of conversation about the politics of climate. It's like, don't bother me with the politics. I can tell you what's happening now. So, what I want to know is what you're doing about it. How can you help us? How can you make sure that the uh, utilidor that houses the water and sewer line is not going to be eroded because of coastal erosion and drops into the water, and now we don't have water
Yeah.
here. So it's a pragmatism that causes me to look at some of the debate about the wording and uh, how we phrase things. Because when I go back home and I tell people that we talked about words, they're like, okay, and so what's happening now that the words are
Yeah.
done? How is this translating? And so I think so much of it comes back to how do our words translate into actions? How do we see that on a level that means something to the average Alaskan? And this is where I take it back to the infrastructure bill. What people are seeing now is tangible. It is meaningful. When we're talking about how we can help communities be more resilient, whether that is helping you build out a seawall to keep the winter storms from hammering you, or what we are doing working with the cold climate housing
Mm.
center to develop these technologies that will allow you to put a home on the tundra without it going cattywampus, that's a technical term, in a year after it's built because you've had permafrost thaw
Yeah.
underneath.
Yeah.
How are we using these technologies real world, real time? And so I I I recognize that where we're trying to get in addressing our level of emissions is important and needs to be an imperative. But I want to make sure that the people that I represent back home, who are some of the most energy vulnerable people in the country today, are not in a place where they are penalized in the sense of having their energy costs increase because this is what we have to do through a price on carbon to address the demand side.
Mm.
They're looking at it from the perspective of I live in a cold, dark place in the wintertime. And how can you make sure that not only I'm able to have access to energy, but that it is affordable as well? So these are real world challenges that I face every single day, and I do it with enthusiasm because it really, really matters.
Another huge challenge in global decarbonization, another potentially huge opportunity, for Alaska, maybe for the United States whole, is the minerals challenge. So many of the technologies that are going to be essential for decarbonization are much more mineral intensive than some of the things that they're supplementing or replacing, depending on which, it's just which extraordinary curve you look at in terms of how much additional copper or nickel or cobalt or lithium is going to have to be produced and processed around the world to enable all these technologies. Um, do you see, and yet in the US, our domestic, certainly mining conversation, and even our domestic conversation about more mineral processing facilities and domestic manufacturing facilities is sometimes really challenging. Again, back to the permitting debate you mentioned earlier. What path forward do you see for minerals in the US? What path forward do you see for US collaboration with our friends and allies on minerals and minerals processing?
This is another area where we've got to be pragmatic.
Yeah.
We want a lot of stuff. We want everything from your tablet here to, our jet aircraft, and it requires minerals. It just does, and they come from the earth or perhaps under the seabed floor. Controversial area, most certainly. But our reality is we cannot talk about how we're going to achieve these goals without thinking about the mechanisms, the tools that allow us to get there. And we've got access to these minerals. And so how how we're able to uh, to build out that source of supply is the ultimate challenge for us. We are resource rich in the United States of America, and certainly in my state, we are very resource rich. But to your point, we're not building mines, not very rapidly anyway. The time to build a mine, you want to talk about permitting, we all know how long that takes in terms of a process. So we're doing a lot to kind of say we'll get it from somewhere else. Well, that somewhere else may be putting us in a tough spot when we then have to defend another country's human rights issues or their wage and labor standard issues or their environmental practices. But hey, we need this stuff right now. Well, I think we need to critically look at this as a country. We need to look at this through the lens of how vulnerable do we really want to be? How reliant do we really want to be on others? So I've got a perfect example of a mineral resource, graphite. Everybody's looking for graphite. We have probably the most significant flake graphite find in the country
Mm.
in an area north of Nome, Alaska, right close to the coast. It's not a new mine. It was actually an area that had been mined back in the back in the 40s, and there's a great deal of interest with this resource find. So one would think that this would be an easy ask to the Department of Energy. Help us with maybe utilizing the Defense Production Act.
Mm.
It was actually it was actually a really good effort to work with DOE to get that and DOD to get graphite one included within the DPA. But we also need to look to what we're doing not only for purposes of the deposit, but then how are we processing it? You've mentioned that we've got um, uh, we've got a situation or a project located down in Louisiana. No problem with Louisiana, but they're processing graphite that's going to be coming in um, from Mozambique. I believe it's Mozambique. Um, my question was, let's talk about Alaska. Let's let's get the source
Mhm.
here if we have the source here. So we've got a lot more that we need to be doing, have to be doing, but we have to be doing it in in balance with those who are living there. And this is for us in Alaska. This is not a new story. This is not a new issue. It requires a level of engagement with the people who live in the region, whether they're the native villages that exist there, or those for whom they will be impacted by such a development. So these are hard, but they're not impossible. But we have to go into these conversations as partners at the table. We cannot go into an area, say in remote Alaska, and pretend that nobody lives there. Pretend that the developer who's coming in has more knowledge about the region than the native people who have lived there for 1,000+ years. And so how we engage is important on so many different levels, and it makes it hard, but then at the end, if you have done your job right, if you come in as partners, then you have projects that gain the social license to operate, that gain the acceptance, and that's what we need to be doing. So we've got so much work to do on the critical minerals and really all minerals side, but this is something that I think the United States needs to be looking very, very closely at what we're doing, where we're getting our minerals, and what that then means for us.
I want to ask you about one last technology that I know has been near and dear to you. You're the author of the Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act. I believe you're the only member of the United States Senate that's actually read the entirety of the Energy and Futures Initiative's CDR roadmap report. You've gone very, very deep on this topic. Obviously, the bipartisan infrastructure law included a massive investment in carbon dioxide removal, and the Department of Energy has just started to actually get out that first generation of direct air capture hubs and other things. Um, and yet here at COP, it's a controversial topic, and you have a number of folks who say, well, this is in some way delaying action, or it's a substitute for action. Um, how do you see CDR removal, ocean-based removal? How do you see that in the context of the solutions here?
If we're going to achieve the goals that everyone here at this conference is talking about, you've got to have different you've got to have different solutions here. And this is exactly one of them. It's not going to be the end all be all, but is it going to be part of 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 the mechanism that allows us to get to the level of emissions reductions that we're seeking? And so, let's not quibble over whether or not this just extends the future of hydrocarbons. Our reality is we're going to continue to be utilizing hydrocarbons for a long period of time. Maybe we're going to move our transportation fleet. We're already changing that. We're seeing dramatic changes in other areas. But why would we not want to try to be smarter with with this capture? Why would we not want to do that? I can see why you don't want to use it as just the one and only. Let's put all of our eggs in that basket. But it is absolutely a part of the solution. And I think it must continue to be. I'm excited. We have up on the North Slope, the Arctic Slope Native Corporation was successful as part of the direct air capture. They didn't get the big
But
grants.
they got one of the risk
They
reduction awards.
they
Yep.
got one of the risk reduction awards.
Yep.
So for us, it's really kind of exciting to
Yep.
think about what this is going to mean up there.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I don't think we take the position that nope, we can't do that. I think we should do it, and I think we need to look at it as one of the tools that we have as we work to reduce emissions and to hit the goals that have been set.
Well, thank you so much for all of your leadership on these issues. Thank you so much for making this very long trip all the way to this side of the world and championing all of this. Thank you for everything you're doing and your leadership and your bipartisanship in moving all of this agenda forward. And thank you to our friends at ASU and the Rainey Center for creating this, and to all of you for joining us here today for this terrific discussion. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.